So I said one of the issues with Kantianism and utilitarianism is they don't seem like they're able to give much of an account of what the link between being morally good and having a good, or to use Aristotle's language, we might say flourishing life. And most of us do think there's some kind of link, right? Hope there's a link, right? If we didn't think that, most of us, if we have children, we try to raise them to be good people. You know, as the philosopher Robert Adams says, he's like, well, most of us don't try to, like, we would think it was horrible to raise our children in a way that we try to harm them. We try to make them into something that would be bad for them. If morality is bad for people, well, and that seems odd, right? That we try to make our children, we try to help them become good people. So, I do think there's a real pressure of like, well, what's the link between leading a morally good life and being a good person, right? And think back to Thrasymachus's challenge at the beginning of the semester. Morality, justice is for suckers, he says. You know, Plato tries to go a little bit of way to showing that he's wrong, but we didn't get the whole picture. And part of what I think Aristotle is doing is, answering that challenge. So, how are we going to count? How are we going to show, or at least give an argument that there's a connection between being a good person, a morally good person, and, leading a good or flourishing life? So, this is actually where Aristotle starts. He starts with this question: what is a flourishing human life? Flourishing, if you guys bought the Beresford translation, if you look at some other translations, sometimes you'll see happy. It's a translation of this Greek word eudaimonia or eudaimon. I don't read ancient Greek, so I'm just going on what people who do have told me. But, there's no one English word that really captures its meaning terribly well. For some reason, people would use happiness in a lot of translations. That doesn't capture it at all. Flourishing is a bit better. A good life, a life that is good for you. And Aristotle will say, okay, what's a flourishing life? Well, he starts by giving some criteria for what he thinks is a flourishing life. He doesn't list these as neatly as I think he should. You kind of have to tease them out from the reading, especially the last one. But these are the criteria he uses for looking at different answers to the question, what's flourishing, what is a good human life? And I think we'll be better off as we look at, both Aristotle's own answer to this question and some answers that he doesn't like if we get these in mind. So, 3 criteria. It must be worth pursuing for its own sake. It must be complete or lacking nothing that it makes sense to want. And it cannot be easily lost or taken away. Now, I'm not going to go into what each of these mean right now because I think actually it'll make more sense to do that as we talk about what Aristotle thinks are some common but wrong answers to the question, what is a good, flourishing human life? And he talks about 3 answers that people commonly say. If you ask the man on the street in ancient Athens, he thinks you would very likely get back one of these answers. One thing I'll also note, Aristotle thinks these are all bad answers. He does not have a super high opinion of the views of the person on the street, the average person. And I'll just go on and say this. There is an elitism to Aristotle's philosophy that we should face up to and keep in mind as we go through this. Some people are just better at morality, better at knowing what morality requires than others. We might be a little hesitant on that view. Aristotle is not. All right, so let's look at these common but wrong answers. And these are interesting because, I think if you ask the person on the street in Norfolk or Virginia Beach or wherever, you might often get answers of this sort, right? So the first is the money-making life, where a person tries to make as much money as possible. Being as rich as you possibly can be, flourishing life on this account. Second is respect or fame, being famous, being well known. That is a flourishing life. Final common but wrong answer to the question is just pleasure. And by pleasure, Aristotle means exactly what the utilitarian means by this. Just things that we find pleasant. He thinks all of these fail. Well, how? Let's take the money-making life. Of the three, this is the one that Aristotle seems to have the least respect for. And look, Aristotle's not stupid, right? He's not going to deny that it's good to have money, right? All things being equal, having money is a lot better than not having it, right? And Aristotle would not deny that. But is money worth pursuing for its own sake? Think about that for a second. Well, obviously not, right? It makes perfect sense for me to ask you, if you say, I want to make a bunch of money, it makes perfect sense for me to ask you, okay, well, why? And you can probably give me an answer for it, right? Well, you can get a nice house, you can go on vacation, you don't have to worry about misfortune if you have money, a lot of accidents and things like that aren't as serious, aren't as bad if you have money. You have kids, you can pay for a good college for them with money, so on and so forth. But note in each of these cases, money is only worthwhile because you can do something with it, right? There's an old joke in The Simpsons, where Homer's supposed to be really dumb. He has money and he's like, well, why do I care about this? And then a little voice says, well, money can be exchanged for goods and services. Haha. But right, if money couldn't be exchanged for goods and services, if you couldn't use it to do stuff, it'd make no sense to want it, right? So is it worth pursuing for its own sake? No, right? It's worth pursuing when it is because of the things you can do with money, the things that it allows you to get. Is a money-making life complete or lacking nothing worth wanting? Well, think about that. Obviously not, right? You could be as rich as possible and you still might lack things in life that it's worth wanting, right? One prominent one might be good relations with your family or other people, right? There are people who are rich whose children all hate them and who have no true friends, right? If all of your kids hate you, and if the people who pretend to like you only pretend to like you because they want money, you are missing something that would make for a good or flourishing life, good relations with your family, and true friendship, right? All right. And you can fill this out in more ways. There's plenty of other things that a person could be rich and still lacking in life that would make life worth wanting, right? Final one, not easily lost or taken away. Well, obviously money is easily lost or taken away, right? Usually if you're really rich, you don't become poor. Even if you do something stupid like, I don't know, buy Twitter in a temper tantrum, right? Take a random example. But it is easy to lose money, right? If you buy Twitter in a temper tantrum, you are going to lose a whole bunch of money. And it's not too hard, if you're not as rich as Elon Musk, if you're just garden variety wealthy, it is easy through misfortune to lose all your money. You might get sick, the stock market might crash. Wealth, money is very, in a word, it's very easy to lose through misfortune. It obviously fails number 3. All right, well, what about respect or fame? Well, Aristotle would say, look, is it worth pursuing for its own sake? He doesn't think so, right? Think about it this way. Why does it make sense to want to be famous? Well, like money, a lot of it is you can do stuff with it, right? But, if we start thinking about, imagine somebody has a reputation for doing some great thing, but they didn't do it. Aristotle would say that just doesn't make sense, right? Think about participation trophies. Most people don't like participation trophies because they feel hollow and insulting because you didn't actually accomplish anything. Aristotle would say fame or respect is the same way. It makes sense to want it as acknowledgement, as recognition, as confirmation you've accomplished something great. But the important thing is not the fame itself, it is the great accomplishment. If you cure cancer, or you bring peace to the Middle East, or whatever, it would make sense to want acknowledgement for this great accomplishment that you've done, but it is the accomplishment itself and not the fame that is valuable. And now, with money making and fame, I think some of us might say, well, look, Aristotle, there are people who just want to be famous. Famous for being famous. They want that. And hey, Aristotle, let's look at the money making life. There are people who just want to make as much money as possible. Scrooge in A Christmas Carol. And you might say, well, who are you to Aristotle to say these aren't good lives? Who are you to say some people do think money's worth pursuing for its own sake or fame is worth pursuing for its own sake? Who are you to say otherwise? And I think Aristotle would just say, come on, yeah, okay, some people do that. Those people are just obviously wrong, and we all recognize they don't have good lives, right? Someone who pursues money for its own sake, like Scrooge, the whole point of A Christmas Carol is he's living a terrible life, right? And somebody who's obsessed with money for its own sake and doesn't spend it, usually there's some kind of trauma or neurosis or something bordering on almost mental illness there, right? Yes, some people do pursue money for its own sake. Some people do pursue wealth for its own sake. Aristotle would say that's just dumb. It doesn't make sense. When you think about fame for its own sake, it makes perfect sense. Well, why do you want to be famous, right? And when you really think about it, just wanting to be famous, like, I don't know, the Kardashians, or I'm old, so I remember Kato Kaelin, who was famous just for being famous. That doesn't make sense, Aristotle would say. Same things with fame, complete or lacking nothing. Well, for one thing, you could be famous and your life could be lacking the legitimate accomplishments. You might not have actually done the thing you are famous for doing. Lance Armstrong, the cyclist, was famous for all these great athletic accomplishments without cheating. Well, lo and behold, he actually cheated. Well, what was his life lacking? The legitimate accomplishments he was famous for that he didn't really do. Yeah, he rode a bike really fast, but he also doped like crazy. Another example with fame, is it not easily lost or taken away? Well, Lance Armstrong is a great example. He was widely respected, admired, comes out he dopes like everybody else, and now he's literally a joke. You can think of other cases where someone has fallen rather rapidly from being famous, right? You don't even have to cheat, right? You could just be an actor and make one really terrible movie or one really bad album as a musician, and your fame might really take a nosedive. Now, as I said, Aristotle does think fame is not quite as bad as money. It makes sense to want fame as recognition or confirmation for legitimate accomplishments, but again, it's those accomplishments themselves that matter and not the fame or respect. Well, let's look at the last one, pleasure. Well, Aristotle actually does think that pleasure is worth pursuing for its own sake. And I think he'd be stupid to say otherwise, right? You know, it makes perfect sense for me to ask you, why do you want money? You can probably give me a good answer, but it makes sense to ask the question. It makes perfect sense if you want to be famous for me to ask you why you want to be famous. But if you're doing something because it's pleasurable, if you say, well, I'm going to go, it's a nice fall day. Maybe I'm fantasizing about, I like teaching, but maybe I'm fantasizing about what I'd rather be doing than recording lectures. Nice fall day, sunny, beautiful. And I say, I'm going to go to First Landing, or you tell me you're going to go to First Landing. And, well, why? Why are you going to First Landing? It's like, well, it's really pretty. I like walking in nature. It's just pleasant. It's just fun. Or if you say, well, I've just got off work, I'm going to play video games for an hour. And I say, well, why do you play video games? You're like, well, it's relaxing and I just enjoy it. It's just fun. That makes perfect sense of why you're doing the thing you're doing. Video games, going for a long walk at First Landing, watching a movie, whatever, right? If you say it's fun, which is another way of saying it's pleasurable, that makes perfect sense. It would be stupid to say, well, okay, why do you want to have fun? Why do you want to do something that's pleasant, right? That is a stupid question in a way. The question, well, why do you want money or why do you want to be famous is not stupid. All of which means pleasure, at the very least, satisfies number one. It is worth pursuing for its own sake. But Aristotle will disagree with the utilitarian because he doesn't think pleasure is all there is to flourishing. For one thing, pleasure is arguably easily taken away. You're having fun one second, something bad happens, you're not the next. Now, there were ancient philosophers, the Epicureans, who said that, well, if you seek pleasure intelligently, it is not easy to take away. The key to seeking pleasure intelligently is to have moderate desires, enjoy the simple things. I actually think the Epicureans are really interesting. If we had more time, I'd like to read them, but you can't put everything you want into a class, right? So, whether pleasure is easily taken away is arguable. Some philosophers like the Epicureans will say it's not if you're smart about pursuing it. But one thing that I don't think you can argue with, one thing that I think Aristotle is definitely on solid ground on, is that a life can be pleasant and lacking things that make it good or flourishing. Aristotle's an ancient Greek philosopher, so he thinks of examples from his culture, but he thinks of a slightly fanciful example. I'm pretty sure he's pulling this from the Odyssey, right? He's like, look, if some sort of wizard or sorceress, Circe in the Odyssey, was to offer you this deal of, okay, I will transform you into a happy pig. You will just be a pig. You won't remember being human, but you will be as happy as you possibly can. You'll have mud to roll around in, slop to eat. Aristotle would say, look, that would be a really pleasant life, but practically nobody would take the offer to be transformed into a happy pig. If they wouldn't, then this happy or pleasurable life must be missing something we think is good. It must not have everything it makes sense to want. Or if you want to update it into a slightly more modern example, also a little fanciful, a little science fiction, but whatever. Imagine that some mad scientist, well, let me not bias the case by calling him mad. Let me say some scientist has invented a way to stimulate the pleasure centers of your brain. And he says, look, we're going to hook you up to this machine, turn the current on, and you will feel blissfully happy. So happy that you won't want to do anything except lay there and feel happiness. And you're like, well, okay, but if I'm so happy I won't want to do anything else, want to starve? And he's like, no. we're going to put a feeding tube in and we'll feed you that way. And you'll just lay in this bed and experience, happiness for the rest of your days. Yes, terrible things are going to happen to your body. You're going to shrivel up. You might, we'll turn you so you won't get bed sores, but probably get contractures in your hands and all that terrible stuff. But you know what? You won't care because you'll just be experiencing massive pleasure. Now, look, there's practical reasons we probably wouldn't do it. Can we trust this guy? What if the current goes off? But even if you trusted him, most of us would not take that deal. We would say, look, no. There are things that make a human life good, legitimate human accomplishments, friendship, good relations with other people, that someone laying in this bed experiencing just passive pleasure wouldn't get. Or one more example, if you guys have ever seen The Matrix, being in the Matrix is much more pleasant than being in the real world, which is this like nuclear blasted hellscape in those movies. Nonetheless, people still choose to leave the Matrix because they think there's something a good life would have. Living a real, non-deceived life, not in a computer simulation, that this more pleasant life in the Matrix lacks. If that makes sense to you, then you must agree with Aristotle that there is something that it makes sense to want besides pleasure. And so the pleasurable life, even though it answers number one and possibly maybe could do something to meet challenge 3, it's definitely going to fail 2. It is not going to be a flourishing life. All right. Now, having looked at these candidates and seeing why they fail, Aristotle is going to say we're in a lot better position to see what a good answer to this question is going to look like. And it's that we're going to start with in the next lecture.